January event. We're very excited today. We've got some great speakers lined up today to talk about space communication. Before we get started, I want to introduce myself. My name is Rachael Zisk, and I'm a reporter for Payload Space, writing a daily newsletter covering the business and policy of space and a weekly newsletter covering the science of space. So I will drop the links to subscribe to those newsletters in the chat below, but we're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk and hear from our great speakers today. So I want to just jump right on into that with our first speaker, Paul Jurasin. Paul is the director and co-founder of the Cal Poly Digital Transformation Hub, leading a public and private digital innovation team focused on initiatives for moving public sector organizations into the future. Key aspects of his role are working with leading industry partners to develop new technology-oriented programs to promote digital transformation while providing enhanced learn-by-doing experiences for students, providing strategic leadership and executive relationship development with nonprofit, government, and educational institutions as the leader of one of the first members in the Amazon Web Services Cloud Innovation Center program, regularly speaking at conferences and events on topics involving innovation methods and digital transformation. Paul has more than 30 years of experience with digital transformation initiatives in both commercial and public sector organizations. Paul, it's great to have you on today.
Thanks, Rachel. Appreciate it. Glad to be here today. And again, thanks for Foundation for the Future for inviting me to speak again. I think this is maybe the second or third time I've spoken. So one of the things I wanted to do today, and I will share my screen here in a second, so you don't have to look at me the whole time. But one of the things I wanted to talk about today is, I know the topic is space communications this month, and I was thinking about, space communications and what we really want to talk about here. And there's a couple of different aspects of space communications to think about. And one is, of course, the technical aspect, right, where you talk about methodologies for transmitting data between Earth and spacecraft, and between spacecraft and spacecraft to planetary locations and that sort of thing. And I thought about that, and I said, you know what, I'm not an expert on that, so I'm not going to talk about that. But there's another part of communications related to space that I think we do need to talk about, and that I can talk about from my history, is how to talk about space. So it's actually communications about space that I want to talk about, and how we use innovation processes and different techniques to be able to think about what we want the future of space to look like, and how we might use that to look at communications. So I'm going to share my screen here in a second, and I know this always sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Let's try it. Okay, can you all see that?
Yes, looks good.
Okay, I'm going to try to share the whole screen. Sometimes that doesn't work either, but let's try that one. How's that look? Look okay? Or are you guys seeing the better? Okay, good. So just adjusting one little thing here. Okay. So one of the things we want to talk about today then is how to identify challenges and opportunities in space communications. Now I just have to be able to move my screen. There we go. So I know it's early in the morning on the West Coast, not quite so early on the East Coast. So you're going to see a bunch of interesting images, I think, in my slides. Just to keep people awake and keep myself awake, I think. So you'll see my dogs, you'll see my wife, you'll see some interesting photos that I've taken. So they're all my photos. I didn't steal any from anyone. But what I do want to do is give you a little background on myself. And I know Rachel did some of that already, but so my history has been, I've worked for government organizations for about half of my career, maybe a little bit more than that, and with startups and public organizations in other parts of my background. But almost all of the background that I have has been in developing new technologies in various organizations around the country. So I started my career working for the Defense Department and analyzing satellite data. I worked for Digital Globe, which became Maxar, which was the first commercial high-resolution satellite imaging company. If you can see behind my head, that's a model of our one of our first satellites back there. I worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. I worked for the U.S. Geological Survey before coming to Cal Poly. So 10 years ago, I came to Cal Poly to work with the IT infrastructure on the campus. And then after about 4 or 5 years of doing that, I moved into the innovation role, which is the Cal Poly Digital Transformation Hub. So my background around the Cal Poly Digital Transformation Hub is all about working with governments, nonprofits, and educational institutions on figuring out how to solve difficult problems using the latest innovation processes and technologies, and applying those to those problems. So that's kind of my background. Outside of work, I've been a long distance trail runner for a long time. So what I see, this is going to be an interesting analogy maybe, is that when you're talking about big things like space, right? And how do we look at space and how we can move people to space, how we can have more operations in space? It's a long-term process, right? You can't do it today and it's going to be done tomorrow. There's a lot of persistence that has to happen, and you have to stick with it for a long time to be able to actually get ourselves there. Long distance trail running is kind of the same way, right? If you're going to run a 100-mile race, it's going to be difficult. It's going to take a long time. You got to stick with it the whole time, and you have to have persistence. I think that along with space kind of fits together. So anyway, just a quick background on that. Let me move forward a little bit. And as I said, you'll get some interesting photos. So with some of the questions that we want to talk about with space communications, or space in general, really, but in space communications, is how do we make us a multi-planetary society? How does this help now? And why should the public care? Those are all key questions that we need to think about, and how we might answer those questions. By the way, this is actually my dog doing some aerobatics on the beach. He certainly will try to do almost anything to catch that Frisbee of his. So today, then, what I want to talk about is a little bit about the innovation process that we use at the Digital Transformation Hub, which is a human-centered design process. But there's a little bit more to that I want to talk about today, because our innovation process that we use tends to address problems that people are having today, not necessarily problems people are having or opportunities people are having out into the future, 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And I think that is what we need to be thinking about when we think about space. So we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about the tools and methods that we use, and again, the design and futures thinking work that needs to happen to be able to really identify what we're trying to do in space moving forward. We'll talk about the problem statement and how we address the issue we're trying to work on. We tend to use a how might we statement. How might we have Facebook on the moon, for example. And then there's 5 questions that are kind of the core to what we do. And we always ask these 5 questions when we try to solve these big problems. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. Okay. So what are the tools, right? So one of the things, and I guess I'll preface all of this with, when we do workshops that involve trying to solve problems for organizations like this, they tend to be a 2-day workshop. So I'm going to squeeze 2 days into 20 minutes. That's going to be interesting. But what I'll just do is kind of give you guys an overview on what it is we try to think about when we're doing the workshops, and how we think about the future and how we think about solving problems. And the process tends to work for not only space communications, but it works for government issues. We used it at Vandenberg Space Force Base on digital transformation. We use it to help solve the opioid crisis and developing applications for that. So it fits almost any scenario, as long as you're thinking the same way about how to solve the problem. So in general, what we're trying to do here today is talk about, there's two ends of the spectrum, I guess I would say. The first end of the spectrum is, let's think about what we want the future to look like 10 plus years from now. So that's our future scenario analysis, right? Let's think about what we want the future to be like. And when you're thinking 10 years or more out, that tends to separate the realities of today from what the future could be. So those realities of today don't influence that thinking so much. So you can really open up your thinking so that you can say, you know, in the future, 10, 15 years from now, here's what I want that future to look like. I want to be able to have, you know, my family living on a spaceship that's orbiting Mars, and we'll be there for 5 years. It'll be a sabbatical for somebody. But in that 5 years, what are we going to be doing on that spaceship? How can we communicate with our family on Earth? How can we talk to the people who might be living on Mars, living on the moon? You know, those are the kinds of things we just want to think big about that. So there's the future scenario, 10 plus years out. And then if you work backwards, you know, 7 years, 5 years, 3 years, 2 years, and today, what do we need to do in that 10 to 15 years to be able to get to that scenario that we really want the future to look like? So those are two different ways of looking at things, right? You're looking at things that are happening today, pretty tactical, things that you're looking at 10, 15, 20 years in the future, which are pretty conceptual. So the idea is, how do we merge those two ways to think? And you know, there are people and techniques to do that. One is called futures thinking, one is called design thinking. Futures thinking is thinking out into the future, systematic way about thinking out into the future. And what we want to be able to do is prepare for what the future is going to look like and look at what we can do to shape the future to be how we want it to be, whatever those scenarios are. And in the workshops that we do help us to think through what those futures might look like and what we want them to look like. So, you know, this is just kind of a piece of what we work on when we work through many of the scenarios that we work on. So there's a couple of core principles that we think about when we think about futures thinking. And the first thing to remember, futures thinking isn't about predicting the future. It's about understanding signals and drivers that are happening today, and then trying to uncover patterns on where the future might go. So when I talk about signals and drivers, by the way, I guess I didn't mention, I'm certified in futures thinking from the Institute for the Future, not the Foundation for the Future, but the Institute for the Future. And in that certification, we talk a lot about what these core principles are. But the one thing that we try to remember is that it's not about predicting the future. It's about looking at signals, which might be, oh, what's an example of a good signal? Things that are happening in the world that don't seem like they're related, but then once you put them all together, you can say, oh, these signals all point to, you know, Tesla selling more cars, or private spacecraft launching horizontally to deliver satellites into space. We look like maybe we're going in that direction. You know, it's signals like that we look at, and then we look at why these signals are happening and why they might be related, and those are called the drivers, right? So perhaps a driver for horizontally launched space delivery systems are being developed. The driver might be lower cost, faster delivery is needed. We want to be able to be more entrepreneurial, rather than, you know, the other side of that. What used to be the driver is we need big launch vehicles. We need to be able to launch heavyweight vehicles into space, and there's some need for that as well. But anyways, the signals and drivers that you want to be looking at and trying to understand what's happening in the world and how those are all connected. The look back to see forward piece of it is, let's look back and see how innovation has happened in the past and what path it's taken. And we might see that that path is continuing from today and into the future. So if you look at what happened 15 years ago and what you might have looked at and said, what is it going to be like in 2023? And I'm in 2005. Would we have predicted in 2005 what the world is like today? And if we would have, what path is that taken, and where are we going into the future? So let's look at those steps that are ongoing. And if there's something in that path that's ongoing and we don't like it, maybe we can do something to change that path to get to a future we really want versus where it tends to be going today. That's another thing we want to look at. And creating a community is really important in futures thinking as well. You want to have lots of people who are looking at what that future might look like. And even better, you want lots of people that are on the same wavelength to try to get the future to be where you want it to be. Foundation for the Future is doing that, of course, with much of the work they're doing. They're seeing that the government needs to support space infrastructure in a way to create a better future for the space industry, for example. So those are the kinds of things we want to look at there as well. So the Aerospace Corporation, a couple of years ago, some of you, maybe all of you, have seen this, and they created something called the Pathfinder's Guide to the Space Enterprise. But really, they used futures thinking. They got a bunch of stakeholders and experts together, and they started thinking about what space might look like in 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And they mapped it out to see what the interactions might be between the different areas like workforce, exploration, resources, conflict, all of the kinds of things that might be happening out in the future. And they did a really great job of this. By the way, you can all go out onto the web and get it yourselves if you want. You can just search for Aerospace Corporation, Pathfinder's Guide to the Space Enterprise. And I thought they did a really great job of thinking about what the future might look like, and how to start looking at how we might change that future based on what's out there today. So futures thinking, future foresight, kind of related areas. And it's a really powerful tool, I think. Kara Kunzman and her team at Aerospace did a great job with this. So one of the things that's kind of core to what we work on is looking at the needs of the customer. The customer are really the people who are going to be affected by the decision that you all are making, or we all are making, regarding opportunities and challenges. Sometimes in the industry, software industry, people will develop really cool tools that don't solve any problem, but they look cool. What we want to be able to do is look at what we're trying to solve a problem for. And before we come up with a really cool solution, we should really know what we're trying to solve a problem for. So that is pretty important and core to what we think about as well. So then, now that we've looked at the future, we want to figure out how do we solve the problems today and more near term to be able to get to that future we want. So long-term to short-term thinking, human-centered design. What we do at the Digital Transformation Hub is really focus on the customer's needs and try to meet those needs while keeping the future goal in mind. And keeping that future goal in mind is really important. And we want to be able to drive to that goal, be persistent about what that future goal is while solving near-term problems and challenges. So, I mentioned those 5 questions. These are the 5 questions that we ask every time we try to solve issues and come up with opportunities into the future. We always want to understand who the customer is. Today, for example, if we're thinking about space communications, our customer may well be students who are in middle school, or students who are in elementary school, because those are going to be the customer that's going to be utilizing the solutions that we come up with in the future. So we want to define who the customer is we're trying to solve a problem for, and what is the real opportunity that we're looking at, and why do we want to do that. So the other thing we want to look at then is, if we can solve a problem or come up with an opportunity, what's the real benefit for that? If we don't have a real benefit in solving a problem or coming up with a solution, we have to ask the question, why are we doing this? So we want to make sure that's clear. The 4th question is, how do we know what our customer wants? That's a harder one. And we want to make sure we include the customer, whoever that may be. Maybe it's middle school students, maybe it's their parents, maybe it's the workforce of today. But we want to include them in the problem solving effort. We want to make sure their ideas and their thoughts and their opinions are included in everything we do. And then we want to prototype what the experience looks like before we go and spend $5, $10, $100 million on a solution. We want to make sure we create a low-cost prototype to be able to come up with that solution. So I'm not going to go through in great detail what some of the details are in our workshops, but we do an ideation workshop, which brings in subject matter experts and stakeholders, and we get them to talk to each other about what their needs are. We come up with hundreds of ideas, we narrow those down to a couple of really good ones, and then we take that idea, we bring it to life in the best way we can to get it in that customer's hands. Sometimes it's just a drawing, sometimes it's a digital prototype, sometimes it's a hardware prototype, but we want to get that solution in the hands of the customer so they can look at it and say, yeah, that's what I want to do. Nope, that's not what I want to do. This will work for me. It won't work for me. We want to get that information into the hands of the customer and listen to what they say about it, and then refine the idea and get it back in their hands and refine the idea some more until we come up with a viable prototype that looks like maybe this is really what we want to do before we go and implement any kind of a solution that's going to be expensive and permanent, right? We want to make sure that we can continue to refine that solution until we get it out in their hands. We then create a vision document with a clear, concise definition, and everything we just talked about ends up being in that vision document, and that vision document becomes the guiding force behind all of that solution development. And that vision document also needs to be connected to the future that we're looking for as well. So we want to make sure that future and the vision document of today, make sure they link together, because we don't want to be doing things today that don't drive us toward that future vision we want to get to. So that's another of the things we want to do here. So there's some core things. No, I'm almost there on my time. There's a couple of core things that we want to make sure that we're addressing when we work through the futures and design thinking methodologies and solving these problems. First is to think differently about the opportunities we might have. So by thinking differently, it really means understanding where we want to go in the future, out 10, 15, 20 years, and then look at what's possible today to be able to get us to that future that we see out 10 or 15 or 20 years. We want to take the steps to make sure we get there. So exploring the art of the possible is that. What's possible today? What might be possible in 5 years? And let's drive to that and make sure we keep that vision of the future in place. And of course, changing the culture of how we think is all about how we do this as well. I am going to do a quick summary and then I'll stop. So we want to be able to utilize the tools that we have available to us, make sure we use those tools in the way that can help most in identifying the opportunity that we're trying to identify, keeping the customer at the forefront of all of our decisions. So, in the human-centered design, we want to make sure it's the human that's validating what we're doing. We want to, of course, think about the future and what we want it to be, and then think big, create lots of ideas, make sure the solutions that we come up with benefit the customer, not only today, but in the future, and who that customer might be in the future. Visualize the solutions, and then, of course, test, iterate, and change as necessary to get to where we can actually develop the best solutions. And we want to be able to listen clearly to what we're getting back as feedback. Okay, I'm going to stop and see if there are any questions. Any questions? I know that was a lot of information in a really short time. Like I said, 2 days worth in 20 minutes.
Thank you so much for that, Paul. Yeah, if anybody on the Zoom has any questions, please feel free to drop those in the chat or just raise your hand and you can turn your camera on and ask yourself. I will prioritize those questions, but since we've got a few minutes here, Paul, I'm curious about what advice you have for envisioning a future that is realistic in the space context specifically, since I know that often in space, we have these kind of big dreams for the future and timelines for one reason or another just tend to slip further and further back as time goes on. So I'm curious what kind of constitutes a realistic vision for the future in the space context.
Yeah, that's kind of a that's an interesting question, because when we actually are thinking about the future out 10, 15, 20 years, what may be possible in 20 years, we don't know what that is yet. But the idea being, what if you have that ultimate vision out there, even though it's 10 or 20 or 30 years away, you can start working on things that might drive you toward that vision. And there are other things that are going on today, and this is part of that signals and drivers thing that I talked about. You want to be able to see what's being developed technologically out there in the world today, where that's going as well. And you can start connecting those dots to say, you know what, they're working on a global infrastructure for satellite communications on Earth today with Starlink and Kuiper and organizations like that. How can we move that to, say, the moon or Mars or another planet where that global communications can happen there as well? So those are the kinds of things I think we need to look at. But I think thinking big and dreaming about what the future might look like, I don't think we want to limit that too much. Where we want the limits is what we can do in the next, say, 2, 5, 7 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Jonathan Josephson has a question. He says, how do you prioritize solutions from ideations?
So the way we've done this before is when we bring our subject matter experts and stakeholders into an ideation session, we come up with hundreds of ideas on how to solve a particular problem. And then we categorize those ideas, right? So different people are coming from different angles on that. We categorize those, we come up with the major categories that those ideas are coming from. And then one of the methods we use is that we let all of the stakeholders vote on what they think the best ideas are. One of the things that we do sometimes as well is we have people vote on what the worst idea is that's come up with. And what we find in many cases is the idea that came up as the worst idea ends up moving all the way back up to being the best idea, because it tends to be, the worst idea tends to be one of those ideas that people are like, no, we can never get there. Then you start asking why can't we do this? And people are like, well, because the policy says we can't do that. And we're like, let's change the policy. Or, it costs too much. Well, does it really cost too much? Or are there cheaper ways to do something? So anyway, that's how we tend to narrow down the ideas, is we have the stakeholders themselves vote on the ideas, and then we focus on how whatever we think the best ideas can solve the problem.
Okay, great. Really interesting. It's a really interesting way of thinking about the future and planning for the future that we want to have. So I appreciate your presentation very much, and thank you for coming on and sharing that with us today. I think if there are no more questions in the chat, I'll hold on for one more second. That is another second, but I think that we are ready to move on to our next speaker. So thank you so much, Paul, for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, and so now I think I am going to introduce our next speaker. So up next, we have Coffee on the Moon with the Galaxis gal Inara Tabir. Coffee on the Moon is our new monthly segment. If you missed part 1 last week, you can find the recording of the live stream on any of F4F's social media channels. But in this monthly segment, Inara will be holding interviews to discuss our monthly topic and how this topic of reference, we can work together to be a multi-planetary society. So Inara, take it away and introduce us to today's guests you're interviewing.
Rachel, thank you so much. I'm excited to be back here with Conversations for the Future, and it's particularly this guest today, Amy Imhoff.
Hi, everybody. How are you?
Hey, Amy. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. This is going to be such a great chat.
Absolutely. So Amy works with individuals and small businesses to create, maintain, and grow their digital presence through website design, social media, marketing collateral, editorial content, and more. She also hosts panels at conventions and writes for a variety of entertainment websites about women in media, especially in science fiction. Her current role as Director of Outreach and Strategic Partnerships at Explore Mars, a little nonprofit funded by NASA. When do you sleep? Or do you sleep?
I do sleep. I sleep pretty
Okay.
often, frankly.
You got it
You
all
got to
covered.
prioritize that healthcare, that self-care, right? Sleep is self-care.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So explain to me how you got from what led you into this path in life? Like, what was your entry into media, communications, sci-fi?
So I've always been a science fiction fan. I was a fan of Star Trek: The Next Generation starting at 7 years old. So, I came up with Picard and the crew. And then, of course, when I was 13, a captain named Captain Janeway strolled onto the scene. And, my life was pretty much changed. It was great to see a woman in the captain's chair. And I really think it opened up a lot of possibilities to me. And also, all throughout high school and college, I'm a big nerd. Look at my collection I have behind me here. I got my Janeways and my Scullys. I'm a big X-Files fan as well. So I really just started engaging with fandom at that level, and I've met so many wonderful people through my fandom. And when I started going to my first Star Trek conventions, I saw that there were panels being given on women's representation in sci-fi, and there were also not a ton of women hosting panels on main stages. So I felt that that was definitely a glaring omission on behalf of convention runners. So I was trying to get more women in those spaces. I would have women come up to me after panels and say, "Oh my goodness, this was such a great conversation. You asked questions that, are different and new." And I think that the subjects on the stage also really took to that. I found that the actors, of course, if we've all been to conventions, actors have getting the same question over and over again. So I really want to ask them about what they're excited about, what gets them out of bed in the morning, things that we all love, like what are you watching? What are your favorite books? Where are you traveling? That kind of thing. So I'm just, I was always very interested in that area. I started doing panels in, I think it was 2013. So I guess 10 years at this point. And that led me to, doing more and more with fandom, with commentary, writing for anthologies, just general science fiction. I'm like I said, in addition to Star Trek and X-Files, I love Battlestar Galactica, Lost, all of these property, The Expanse, most recently For All Mankind, which I won't shut up about because I love it so much. And in 2016, it was the 50th anniversary of Star Trek. They put the Women of Trek panel on the main stage at Star Trek Las Vegas, and I said, "Well, we need a captain. We need Kate Mulgrew." And one thing led to another. And in 2018, I started as Kate Mulgrew's media director. So I do all of her social media, book tour stuff, website, lots of different things, whatever she needs in terms of media and interacting with her fans. So that has been a dream come true. I would like to note that I did work for 12 years in a cubicle situation. I went from being a financial editor to being a technology editor and writer with Gartner. And then I just really realized that this is not the path for me. I'm not meant to sit in a cubicle all day. I'm meant to be more dynamic, more creative, being able to execute, being able to plan big events. And I really said to myself, how am I going to get to that point? And in March of 2017, Gartner went through a bit of a reorganization and a bunch of people got let go, including myself. And it turned out to be the best thing that could have happened. So I started my own digital content business. I went a little bit from one thing to the other. I taught college writing for a while. I was at a small technology company that really didn't know how to utilize media and social in a way that I felt was effective. And it kind of let me see that, I have this knowledge base. I'm able to execute. I think maybe I could help small businesses and individual people like Kate lend other Star Trek people who, a lot of the actors are over 60. They came up at an age when it wasn't, they're not digital natives. I'm barely a digital native myself. I'm like right on the cusp. I had an analog childhood and a digital adulthood is what I like to say. But this is wonderful. Thank you for having me here. And of course, that is what led me to you, Inara, at Star Trek Las Vegas this year. Inara's with Gaze in Space. And I've been doing stuff with Dan and Gaze in Space for a couple of years now. And just meeting you was wonderful and serendipitous. And she said, you need to come join our space family. And I said, well, I found my next client base. So space marketing and being able to connect the fans with the people in the space industry, because the fans have the interest. You know, we need to generate this excitement that we haven't really seen since the Apollo program. We need to generate that for Artemis. I want to generate that for what all these private space companies are doing, because we have such a global space economy now that, you know, they need to have their product and their ideas, broadcast out into the world.
Absolutely. So it sounds like visibility was pivotal to your life choices and to the path you took.
Yeah.
That's, one of the themes I definitely want to cover. There's this understanding I think you and I both have about how sci-fi and science interact and about how they feed off each other. I like to say that the very first sci-fi began when the first cave person was outside and looked up and saw the stars and was super excited and was like, what is going on? And then they go back to their cave and they're etching what they think they see. And then culture begins derived from this. It starts to grow. That feeds the scientists that start. And so it's back and forth. And you can really apply this to Gene Roddenberry, his life and his inspiration in the sciences. And then he created this sci-fi, and that has created so many scientists. There's something powerful about it. I think when we look at the Apollo era, we created a national myth. We created a living sci-fi, if you will. These astronauts were, like jet fighter pilots, and they were standing in front of Corvettes, and they were, the great heroes. And so that excitement that was created was absolutely scripted. I mean, it was well-deserved. They did amazing things, but it was a scripted journey that brought the whole nation together for this, Cold War mission to be the first in space. I think something happened at a point where sci-fi overtook reality. So we had this amazing larger-than-life moment where Kennedy's saying, by the end of the decade, we're going to be on the moon, and people couldn't believe it. They were like, this is not real. This was the stuff of sci-fi. But then there was a point where we had done that, and then sci-fi was pumping out like better graphics. Star Wars came along, Star Trek came along, and people got more excited about the fiction than they did about the reality. And so I saw this, I think we've all seen this fizzling of public interest where instead of getting together for family barbecues to watch the launches, people were like, oh, okay, cool. Something's happening in space, or they don't even realize it. Now we're at a point where sci-fi, we see things like Avatar from James Cameron, and it's like the height of our abilities in storytelling, but people are getting really excited again about space, like especially with the big companies like SpaceX and Axiom and Blue Origin. Have you noticed a shift as far as like the connection between sci-fi and science from your perspective, from the media side?
I've definitely noticed that people are implementing these ideas that we never thought that we would be like, carrying an entire encyclopedia, camera, calculator, email device around in our pocket, and that we would all have them. One that could also like gamify that experience. So it basically took everything with media and put it into the palm of your hand. And, we saw that on Star Trek with the pads and the tricorders and all of those things that were really just Gene Roddenberry's brainchild, and, the prop masters and of Star Trek, and how that they designed what our future was supposed to look like, which I find very fascinating, of how like, prop evolution and how art departments take, these everyday things, and they give them a fresh coat of paint and a fresh look and a fresh design. Like the Michael and Denise Okuda really designed the look of Star Trek Next Generation, which was a very big departure from kind of the candy colored uniforms of the original Star Trek. And, we look at the laptop sitting on Picard's desk now, and it looks really big and clunky because we have like these super streamlined, the MacBook Air and all that. So it's very, of course, you see the evolution of how that worked out in between, these scientists that were coming up into developing this technology. And I get so many women in particular, obviously everyone of all genders, but women in particular coming up to Kate at, I sit at her table during conventions. I hear all the conversations that she has. I hear women come up to her and give her a copy of their thesis and say, I dedicated this to Captain Janeway. She's the one who said, and Kate will say, this repeatedly, which is, I was told, she'll have a woman come up to her and say, I was told as a woman that I'm going to be in a lab. I'm going to be, helping to work on these technologies that are going to put people in space. No, I don't want to sit in a lab. I want to go to space. I want to do this. I want to be the next generation of astronaut. And like you were talking about with that narrative, they made it cool, right? They stood in front of their Corvettes. They did like a media campaign, a media blitz. And it's so important to get messaging out there and to have everybody and it was so much easier, I think, to have everybody on the same page media wise in the 60s and 70s, because you didn't have, every astronaut has their own social media platform, which is great. And I think we should follow all of them and see what they're up to. But it was a very cohesive marketing campaign that they put together. And it's interesting that you made that point, really. I think seeing the technology outpacing on the screen, outpacing what we're doing and what we're capable of doing, that lets us dream, right? That leaves us to have that space in order to say, well, what's next? What's next after an iPhone? Because there's going to be that evolutionary step forward in the science and the technology. And I really think a lot of it is probably going to be energy based in the future. We've been talking and looking at different technologies. I think of Kate did The Man Who Fell to Earth. She played the head of the CIA. And that is, of course, a remake of a much older property. We need nuclear fusion. We have scientists that have already kind of maintained it for like a few seconds. I just read an interesting article on that recently about how we have to the way you bombard. I am an English major. I would like to note that I am an English major. So I'm communicating these scientific topics in a conversational but educational way. And if I am wrong, somebody leap into the chat and tell me I'm wrong. But we do need nuclear fusion. And I think once we surpass that, we're going to change. If our goals for space, everything that we're going to use for space is going to be used here on Earth first. We're going to improve our lives here on Earth first. So people say, why should we spend money on organizations that are, telling us what we need in order to have deep space travel? Because we're going to need that technology here first. It's going to have, 20 different implementations here before it gets out there. So I think that evolution and watching that happen has been really cool as somebody who's grown up with, dreaming about that Star Trek future. And also, there's a component of it that is not just technological, there's a component of it that's social and, progressing us socially as a society. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir when I say science is real. LGBT people have extreme value in our society. These concepts that I think we're still fighting over, especially, in the last 6 years since the Trump presidency and this devaluation of science and all of that, that's setting us back. So I'm always interested to see who's moving that bar forward.
Absolutely. And I think you make a good point. We need fusion. We need all kinds of technologies. I think we're going to nail fusion in a big way long before we learn to be good to each other.
Oh, yeah.
And that's important, but we are moving closer and closer. There was this shift from government space with NASA to new space. Jerry O'Neill calls it the quiet revolution, where we went from this kind of centralized control of that world to private industry and the market being able to diversify all the different ways we can interact and we can go after those futures. I think we had a shift where we went from being very concerned with how we message the public and getting them on board and having the national ethos be in line with us to NDAs and backroom deals and having to keep your technology quiet for competitive reasons. And so the standard has become the standard became, don't let anyone know what you're doing too soon, because then they'll get ahead of you. And in that, I think in that mix, we lost the connection with the public. And that's one of the ways I think we did. Now we're trying to re-engage with the public on the space side. We do amazing things. There's all kinds, and I'm sure people in this room, just like me, are privy to information behind the scenes that would blow people's minds. We have so much happening, and we're really pressing in the next 20 years to make humanity multiplanetary in big ways with the public. The reaction often is, why are you wasting money doing these things that don't matter when you could be doing, you could be saving the rainforest or feeding the homeless or, these things that do matter, but they have these things they've lined up in their minds of these are the things we should be doing. We get that reaction often, where in Hollywood, it's $600 billion a year. And they're like, why haven't you made the next thing I can binge watch? Why isn't the next season out yet? Like the public is engaged with the storytelling on the Hollywood side. From your perspective, from both, that you've seen both sides, like what could we do better? What are we missing on this side that would help engage the people more?
I do think that cohesive messaging is what we really need to be focusing on. And also just a narrative of, it's interesting, the way misinformation spreads, and the way our social media platforms have, bots and all of these, the technology, like you said, the technology is it's interesting because the technology we think has evolved to do good, right? But some of the technology is not doing good, and we know that. We all know that, and we all worry about things like data privacy and security, and I think that the way that we need to kind of get that messaging out to kind of get people excited about space, look at the biggest properties on Earth, right? The biggest properties are Marvel, Star Wars. Yes, Disney owns half of them, and that's a problem too. But Star Trek, just the things that people are excited about and that get them tuning in and get them binging and talking about things on social media. Like, for example, I think For All Mankind is actually a great example here, because I say to people, are you watching For All Mankind? It's on Apple TV. And they go, no, what's it about? And I'm like, well, it's what if the space race never ended? But it's also, what if women were involved in the space program from the beginning? Because Russia, and this is not a spoiler, at the end of season 2 of the whole show, season one, episode 2, Russia puts a woman on the moon. And it causes Nixon to say, where are the women? Where are the women in our space program? We need to get these pilots in here. So they bring in a class of, 7 or 8 female pilots, just like they did in reality. But those women never got to go. Sally Ride finally got to go and be the first American woman in space. But, you have women who were a part of the Mercury group who never got to go up, that stuff like that. So it changes. The best part about For All Mankind is it could happen. It's an alternate history. So you see that because of the way they invest in the space program, they get iPhones essentially, or Blackberries, in the early 90s. It shows the progression of technology. And the reason people are not watching For All Mankind, this is not a diss, Sony is not marketing it to the right people. If they marketed it to the Star Trek fans and they knew how to engage with Star Trek fans on Twitter, that show would be so much bigger. Yes, it's great that we're finally spreading it through word of mouth now that it's completed 3 seasons. But not a lot of shows even make it to 3 seasons these days. So you need to come out of the gate and say, look at this slate of amazingly talented actors that we have here. Look what they're doing. I should be seeing Sonia Walger's picture in Times Square when I go into the city. They should be like, this is the first woman on the moon. We still haven't had the first woman on the moon. And that, to me, that's crazy that it's 2023 and we're hopefully going to get there next year or the year after. So the messaging surrounding something is so important. If they had a coordinated big push, if Sony were putting the money behind For All Mankind, that gets put behind something like the new Game of Thrones show, or, they have it, they have the money exists. It's what you're choosing to promote. It's like, if NASA's choosing to promote a different project, then we're not going to hear about, maybe someone in a lab who's made a crazy breakthrough. They have to put that money and that time and that interviews, put a face on it. The algorithm loves faces. I tell that to people when they're doing social media. You put up a graphic, you want to give people information, but Facebook will downgrade your graphic if it has more than 25% text. So the messaging is what we need in order to get people involved, get the public invested, get the fans who are spending hundreds of dollars on photo ops with Chris Hemsworth and Chris Evans and all the Chris's. We have to take that money, take just some of it, take like 1/7 of it, and give that money to a cause or a technology or a organization that is doing something life-changing, and see what happens. Let them run with it.
So if you have your options, you have your wish, you have like really no limits on what you could do, and you could look at these space companies across the board, how would you institute a policy across the board to create a communication network that would reach outside the bubble? So for instance, space companies, there is no space industry. I think I'll go back to that. There is no space industry, and that's a huge problem. Companies are building for space, but they have this huge problem when it comes to money, where the traditional ideas of where's your exit and what's your risk are profound in the space on the space side, because the exits are often just nowhere in sight and the risks are as high as it gets. And there is no major infrastructure in space. And we talk about being a space company. It's like we're reaching towards space, but there's nothing there to really bring those profits back. So companies are often trying to keep the lights on. And so many space companies arise and fall before the public even knows they exist. And so in that sort of climate where it's really hard to get a space company off the ground and make it successful and give it longevity, communications are just, they're prioritized to get the grants written or to get the government contracts or to be in the bubble of the space conferences. And so they don't really reach outside to luxury brands, fashion, Hollywood, the places where people are. If you have an idea, like share with me some ideas of how we could get those communications off the ground in that kind of environment.
I do think companies need to prioritize their communication departments. I see that, you know, I'll do like a website overview, or I'll check out, let's say I'm thinking about, let's say I need a new client, and I say, okay, who is doing stuff in this sector that I really like, that I think maybe could use my services. Or not even that, just look around at the major players, right? Look around at the major players in the industry. What does their messaging look like? Do they understand social media? I think that is, you get a lot of executives over 50 who are not digital natives. They have not grown up with this, and they don't realize the vast resource of people that are constantly having a conversation all day long. I mean, I could pick up my phone and have a Twitter conversation with pretty much Star Trek fans all over the world about, you know, the Star Trek Prodigy just wrapped. Did you watch it? Did you like it? What did you think about what happened with, you know, you can do that with media in a way that the space industry and a lot of sectors have not harnessed. And I remember when I worked for a technology company, they said that most processes are not automated still. And that's true. It's like a very high percentage of processes are not automated. We think because we can take a picture of a check and deposit it without leaving our house and going to the bank anymore, that we've like reached the point of automated processes. We have not. The major industries like banking and insurance and just any major institution that you use every day to live, like, you know, shipping logistics, like buying logistics, like GE. I remember when I worked for a little tiny app startup right after I left my job in 2017. And they said, it was very interesting, I felt, that GE was still operating in a way where like a very old fashioned model where usually a gentleman would come to your office, and, you know, if you're buying giant parts like giant turbines and giant lighting solutions for warehouses and all this stuff, and he would have a catalog, or the catalog would be on his like computer, and you'd have to pick out the different parts from the catalog, and he would place the order. And there's always a middleman. There was always some kind of like, there was no direct buying option. And to me, I was like, that feels like a very old fashioned manufacturing model that maybe we definitely, as, you know, Americans, we kind of perfected the assembly line. That was something that, you know, was a very unique to American industry that we spread throughout the world. And that was still the process. I was really surprised. I said, you know, our company, our app was creating digital platforms for people to make these big purchases. You know, when you think about, you know, how does an aircraft get built? You know, and I'm learning so much through Explore Mars. I'm learning about, you know, the major players and who makes rocket parts. You know, it's Boeing and Lockheed Martin and Aerojet Rocketdyne and Northrop Grumman and all these companies. But I'm wondering if they have this old school paradigm still, where this is, how do we get these products? How do we order, you know, how do we, and the 3D printing, that's a whole nother area hasn't even, I don't think, been correctly tapped yet. Yes, companies are doing great things with 3D printing, but I think that a lot of these processes are still in an old school fashion. I mean, we just saw with the airline industry, we just saw a major break in the FAA and their software. I think, and I've known that software in this, my dad used to be an air traffic control agent. They're basically still using the same stuff that my dad used in the 70s. So that is just crazy to me. Like, they need to upgrade this.
Can you imagine a computer from the 1970s? I mean, we wouldn't tolerate that in our home. So we definitely.
I know, well, it was really funny because they said that recently there was, I think it was here at JFK where there was an airplane coming in this way, and then they almost collided like this. It was just, they were both on the runway. Nobody was going that fast. But my dad would say they would have near misses all the time because people weren't like looking and talking to each other. If it's still relying on that old-fashioned model of like looking and talking and not necessarily, you know, a new technology or a better technology, then we need to step that up, right? We need to see like, these are the problems that we think are, when something basic fails and people's like freak out, it's like, well, what is driving this force and how can it be made better? How can we take the smartest people in society? You know, that's what Starfleet is, smart people solving problems, right? And
We
those
need
problems.
Starfleet so badly.
What?
We need Starfleet so badly.
We need
100%.
Starfleet so badly. It's true. It's true. But we have
Maybe-
to get to the point where our attitudes are also going to mirror that of Starfleet. Because if we're all, you know, if it's a bunch of admirals in a room screaming at each other, that's not going to work either. So,
Absolutely. Well, maybe as we're trying to put that messaging out to the public that space matters, maybe we need to be reflecting back to the space industry that media and communications matter and giving them the tools that they need to reach the public beyond their bubbles, because that's really the symbiotic flow that's necessary. I want to go to questions really quick, but before I do, let us know, you've got some things coming up with Explore Mars, right?
I do. So our Human to Mars Summit is every May in DC. It's at the National Academy of Sciences, beautiful space. This will be my first one. I'm very excited. We're trying to bring some Star Trek people in. So
Very
that'll
cool.
be very cool in order to, you know, kind of run these discussions with like, you know, the real life Dr. Crusher or, you know, Peggy Whitson, the real life cat. She's not going to be there. She's very busy with Axiom, but, you know, the real life Captain Janeway, you know, these people who are working in our space program in, you know, private sector, that they are going to take the next steps as humanity. So we want to bring those in. Explore Mars is funded partially by NASA, partially by donations from fabulous individuals like everyone watching today. And we really want to provide research and conversation. We provide connection. We provide what humanity needs to take the next steps into space. You know, NASA looks at our research and they make investment decisions based on, you know, this is what we need in terms of like growing food. This is, you know, there's no, unfortunately, there are no rest stops between here and Mars. So if we put so our whole mission is to the moon, because we support a lunar base, we support every kind of infrastructure building on the moon, but then on to Mars, right? So we're hoping we're going to get to Mars by the 2030s. I think it's possible. Especially considering that we've been able to operate a remote aircraft on Mars. Like that is amazing to me, you know, what they've accomplished with the rovers and everything. So yes, please check out our website. It's exploremars.org. We also do a STEM education for young people, especially girls. We partner with lots of different nonprofits like Future Engineers and some of these other really great getting kids into the sciences, kids into STEM. So we have a whole bunch of info on our website. So please do that and follow us. We are at Explore Mars on pretty much everything.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And you can put the link in the chat for us, right?
I will do that. Yes.
So we do have one question. Courtney, actually, would you like to unmute and ask Amy directly?
Sure. Amy, thank you very much. And your passion is most certainly infectious. So thank you for that. I'm an old guy, been in this business about 45 years, primarily in advocating commercial space. I've had my share of a couple of successes, a lot of failures. It's a tough business. And I'm wondering how one translates the enthusiasm in, for example, cinema you referred to. I had the honor recently of interviewing the showrunner, Dr. Shankar, for The Expanse.
Yes, I just saw him on a live cast as well.
Yeah,
so
amazing.
Cool guy,
gentleman.
really cool guy.
And of course, he worked on For All Mankind. So I get it, the enthusiasm, but how, in your judgment, this is a tough question, I grant you, how do you get that, particularly among the young people, to translate that enthusiasm into what really is a lot of hard work? There's not a business for the faint-hearted. And one has to steel oneself for a lot of challenges and so forth. Just your perspective on how do you take that enthusiasm you've referred to earlier and pass it on to the new generation?
I do think that, you know, there have to be changes at an institutional level in order to support diversity in those companies and in you know, Hollywood. You know, we need to have more women behind the camera. We need to have, you know, more women and people of color writing these stories so that you're creating that enthusiasm for everyone, that everyone can see themselves in those roles. the women who saw themselves in Captain Janeway and Scully, have gone on to do some wonderful things. They've also gone on to, for example, with Scully, to criticize the men that wrote her, the men that created her. When the show came back for the X-Files revival in 2016 and 2018, we pointed out all of these flaws and all of these things that they were doing. They were making Scully's fertility the main issue. She didn't get to do a single autopsy the entire 2 seasons. You need to show women, you need to show capable, fabulous women doing these things. You show people of color, show LGBT people. It took until Star Trek Discovery to have a gay couple on a starship. First you need to see it, like the Gina Davis Institute for Gender and Media says, if you can see it, you can be it. And I think that is women and people of color and LGBT and non-binary people, they need to be able to feel like they are welcome in these places. That is a major hurdle, I think. You're finally getting, for example, I interviewed Nami Melamod. She's a composer for Star Trek Prodigy and Star Trek Strange New Worlds. And there are so few women in film music. I could barely name 2 women in film music. And I had a very lovely friend in college who was extremely into John Williams and all of the different awesome film, Basil Polidoro and all of these people that are writing and scoring the things that we love. And the fact that I look at them and there's no women, I'm like, what's going on? You need to feel, young people need to feel. We did this cocktail hour 10 weeks during the pandemic with Kate. She wanted to do something that fans could get into, that wouldn't cost any money. So she said, all right, let's do cocktail hours and I'll pick people every week. And my favorite one was the one that we did with kids under 21. The kids are all right. They really are.
Yeah.
But they also are very quick to call out inequality. They're quick to call out, there were, I think there were 5 girls and one boy in our group because, Kate is, of course, a feminist icon. And I think the challenge, you said, I'm looking at your comment here, they feel motivated to invest the hard work. Yes. But if you keep banging your head against something, people are there's a reason why I'm doing less and less convention panels and doing more and more in the space. I have found that these conventions are run by guys. They're not prioritizing content. They're prioritizing how many photo ops can we fit into this 3-hour period. They want to make money. And I think, seeing the way that we need to get people engaged, get people invested in the idea of space as your reality. That's where it has to change. And a wonderful woman that I met through Inara is Loretta Whiteside. She's fabulous. She has an organization called Space Kind. And she basically said, when she was talking about the concept behind Space Kind is we need to be better to each other up there than we are down here.
Yeah.
Down here we have so many seemingly insurmountable problems, prejudices, racism, sexism, all of these things. And we need to take it to the fact that we're just humans. We're the only humans that we know of. And like I said, we're all going to have to work together in order to achieve the next steps in humanity's evolution in space.
Yeah. Amy, by the way, if I may, just a call out to the late, great Nichelle Nichols, from Star Trek, who, of course,
yes,
I have
you behind me.
Yeah, epitomize what you're talking about. Thank you for your time. Thanks.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for that question. It was very insightful. And yes, Nichelle did a ton to bring. She's literally, the Sci-Fi Sisters from the Trek Geeks Network, a podcast on there, they went and they did a wonderful tribute to Nichelle, and also in the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
Wonderful.
And said, Nichelle said she went to have these meetings at NASA to be a partner with NASA. And she said, this is direct quote from her, which is, where are my people? She says, I'm not seeing Black faces. I'm not seeing, women. I'm seeing white guys. We need to, if you diversify that and bring in other good ideas, and when men have the emotional intelligence to learn how to share a room, learn how to share a boardroom, that's an important skill that I think we need to be instilling and teaching in young people. And a lot of them already have that. A lot of them are like, oh, you're gay? That's fine. Oh, you're non-binary? Great. Oh, you're switching your pronouns? No big deal. That's the attitude we need to take, and not a lot of people.
We have a ways to go, but you're absolutely right.
Yeah, not a lot of people are. Oh, you're welcome. Thank you, Courtney.
Yep.
Courtney, thanks for the question. And then we have time for one last question. Amy, we've got one from Thomas. Thomas says, I think one of the points you all just made is an important one. Can you talk more about how we can strike a balance between the arts and STEM and how they feed off each other?
Yeah, I think the arts are always going to inspire people to take the next step and to create. People are creative. You want to take your expertise and translate that. And I know Thomas, he's a friend of mine. He's a starship designer and an art director for Star Trek Online. So you're a great example of how you're doing that, Thomas, which is you're taking your ability and your passion for digital art and you're applying it to a property that is all completely STEM focused. The people walking around on starships are people who are making, like I said, making the next step. They're working together to solve big problems. And I think, we say STEM and there's also STEAM. And I've been trying to say STEAM more often because, the arts are an integral part of that. And our president at Explore Mars, Janet Ivey, absolutely stellar individual. She is very invested in the arts. She helps and has all of these programs where she works with kids to get them involved in creating and acting and singing and all of the things that give us joy, and that, the music that we're going, hopefully some of those female composers are in there and some of those kids, inspiring them. And we also do the Mars Innovation Challenge. And for kids who are like kindergarten and middle school, these are more like imaginative projects rather than, theoretical scientific implementation, right? So these are like what the little kids are thinking to themselves, well, what are we going to need on a different planet? What's going to happen if we can't breathe the air? What's going to happen if we have to make, farm and grow food? So I think fostering that creativity wherever it comes from is going to lead to more creative solutions for these big problems.
Well, and gaming is a huge industry that Space Force, for instance, is paying attention to. The aerospace industry is paying attention to, because oftentimes that is the entry point for youth. When they start dreaming about these futures, they could be building. I'll ask a really quick question, then we have to go to our next segment. Thomas, really quickly to you, when you're designing these systems for your gaming world, are you ever cognizant that these could impact the real future outside of gaming? And feel free to unmute.
It's all good.
Okay.
He said, just a sec. No, I do know that, the way Thomas implements, the work that goes into creating a starship and, into his ships are also on Picard. So his ships have made the transition from Star Trek Online to actual Star Trek on screen. And it was because fans literally looked at it and were like, why are you copying and pasting these ships? Why don't we have all these cool different ships in there? And Thomas was like, here are the bazillion ships that I have created for Star Trek Online. Let me make them utterly fabulous for you and high res. And, he worked so hard at it. And I'm just very gratified to be able to have friends like that. There you go. You've unmuted.
Yeah. Hi. Sorry. I wasn't expecting to speak. I was not
I like to keep it fresh,
It's interesting. I mean, we're doing, we're really focusing on things that you see in Star Trek in the show. So I think we mainly expect our inspiration to go one way, but we do have things where we have, like, you can go explore like a black hole in the game, or you can see like the jellyfish aliens from Encounter at Farpoint. We have cool things inspired by kind of the science fiction, science fantasy of Star Trek that we try to incorporate in the game to capture people's imaginations. And who knows? I mean, it could be that some people who played Star Trek Online when they're younger, that feeds into their love of Star Trek and their curiosity about space and science, and maybe helps them pick out a STEM career path or a space related career path. I mean, one of the things I'm most proud of, honestly, is that we just inspire a lot of artwork, that a lot of our fans will take screenshots from the game and then they'll run them through some filters in Photoshop or gussy them up or whatever. And I think as a creative person, it's cool being, it's really the highest compliment I can think of is just inspiring other people to also be creative based on the work that you made. So that's sort of.
I'm gonna challenge you. We need to poach you. Amy, maybe we could get Thomas to help us lead a science contest to design ships that could be flown in the future. We're going to have to get you to cross over with us.
Oh, I'm sure he'd love that.
Yeah.
That's all my time. Thomas, Amy, thank you so much. Amy, such a great pleasure. Thank you for coming on. And I look forward. We're going to have you on again at some point.
I would love to come back. Thank you so much. This is great. And what a great group we have gathered today. So thank you again. And you guys can find me on social on at Amy Imhoff 1701. That is the call number of the enterprise to be extra nerdy. So yeah, reach out to me on social if you have questions or want to talk about career trajectory. I'm always happy to help. So thank you again, Inara. This was great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you both so much for that discussion. Really interesting. As a space communicator myself, I'm always thinking about this kind of back and forth ping pong of ideas between science fiction and the actual real life space industry. So it's exciting to hear you guys speaking about that. But before I take up too much more time, I do want to just jump right into our next speaker, Trent Blake. Tow trucks in space for satellites. That is what Galactive is working hard to build. And joining us today is Galactive's captain, Trent Blake. Trent Blake is the co-founder, captain, and CEO of Galactive Inc. Galactive is enabling sustainable space activities as a provider of rapid response satellite servicing capabilities to commercial and government customers. Trent believes that commercialization will drive humanity's presence further into space. For this reason, he leads Galactive's efforts to provide an alternative to existing satellite industry business models and increase the efficiency of future operations. Prior to founding Galactive, Trent honed his operational and technical expertise in the automotive industry as the youngest executive of a franchise auto dealer group in the US. Hi, Trent, great to have you on today.
Hi, Rachel. You saved me a lot on the introduction. I didn't realize I got the full introduction, but no, thank you all for tuning in today. I'm going to be taking a little bit different of an approach to this conversation. I'm going to be speaking a little bit more about the technical communications within space, the efforts that we need to be undertaking to push further into space and become a true spacefaring race. So I prepared a little bit of a presentation for us, and that should be a good stepping stone for us to go into some of the details of how space communications work. And then we'll go into some recommendations that I made. So I know that this panel is kind of going automatically to the group view. So it would help if you tuned into the speaker panel and the views so that you can actually see the presentation, because I spent quite a few hours making this. So awesome. I hope that y'all can see this. And so, like Rachel mentioned, I started Galactive around 2 years ago. We're an in-space services provider that's enabling a robust transportation and logistics community within the space sector so that we can drive humanity further into space. We're starting out in the near space region and like geosynchronous orbit and moving forward and pushing the bounds of humanity so that we can go to the moon, Mars, and beyond. So I always like to start most of these presentations with a quote that further explains why this topic is so important to me. So I'm tapping into the knowledge of the grandfather of modern rocketry, Wernher von Braun. And when he was speaking about space travel, he said that it will free man from his remaining chains, the chains of gravity which still tie him to this planet, and will open to him the gates of heaven. Developing the infrastructure to enable complex missions in and beyond Earth's orbit, including those that rely on reliable communications, is critical to the success of this long-term vision. But von Braun also said, we can lick gravity, but sometimes the paperwork is overwhelming. Galactive is doing our best to lick gravity. We're building the technologies to support this infrastructure already, but we're happy to support and sponsor an organization like Foundation for the Future, who put this event together, to help advocate for this pursuit on a national level. They're doing their best to help with the paperwork that really none of us can do without their help. So in today's presentation, like I mentioned, we'll be talking more about humanity's expansion into space, the importance of the robust space communications network, and some of my personal recommendations for future development. And hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A, but I know that we're running a little bit behind schedule, so we'll see how that goes. So to put space into perspective, it's best to look at how this ecosystem works, what it looks like, and to describe some additional terms. So in my conversation, I'll be referring to near space and deep space quite often. The near space region is everywhere between the traditional Earth's orbits. That's low Earth orbit, or LEO, and geosynchronous and geostationary orbits, or GEO. These are roughly 1,200 miles to 26,000 miles above the Earth's surface. And everywhere approximate after that, approximate 26,098 miles above Earth's surface is the deep space region. This includes Earth's moon, Mars, and really any other celestial body. Humanity's expansion into deep space must occur in phases for its long-term feasibility. Human activity in the near space region is currently driving these efforts, but we want more. We want to push to the moon, to Mars, and beyond. So that requires a concerted effort between nations and humanity as a whole for that to be possible. We already have the robust infrastructure in the near space region, so large constellations in LEO, manned missions to space stations, and a very viable commercial industry within GEO. But additional research and commercial activities will soon enable us to push further. And hopefully one day then we can commercialize the deep space region. So to discuss more about the phases of development that will occur, it's best to divide it into three phases. These are phases based upon how we as humanity leverage efforts and resources and capabilities so that we can all work together and enable a long-term vision so that one day that we can inhabit other planets. While most people will associate this with a timeline, my crystal ball broke last week, so I'm not very confident in my ability to predict the rate of technical progress, and a motivated community can make these happen much sooner than we even project. So I don't want to shroud anything in uncertainty. What I do know, though, is that we're currently in the first phase of development. We're beginning to conquer the barriers to space that allow for the true commercialization of Earth's orbits, and we're learning how to safely push further into space. Autonomous and semi-autonomous systems are already reducing the risk of space activities, and that will only make it simpler for human expansion further in the next phase of development. The continued growth of the space economy and clear safety standards will permit humanity to further explore and develop the deep space region. With future development, the commercial industries of deep space, specifically lunar, Martian, and asteroid resources, will likely drive humanity's permanent presence in space, which is really our long-term goal. But one thing is for certain, a robust space communications network is absolutely vital for the success in humanity's vision to expand beyond Earth's orbit. Otherwise, we'll be looking like this great scene from the modern communications of space, the struggles of the Martian, where there was not a reliable space communications network to enable an astronaut on the ground on Mars to communicate with Earth-based ground stations so that really survival could be possible. I mean, it's a movie about how making survival possible, but that doesn't sound like a very fun existence. And we want to have a reliable, safe opportunity for humans to expand further. So we need to be making efforts to make sure that this doesn't happen. But one thing that we have to understand when we're discussing space communications is that communications isn't just a way for two people to have a conversation. We currently rely on all of our networks to provide all capabilities necessary for space activities, both manned and unmanned. Space communications allow us to command our spacecraft, provide their telemetry and track them, and then also perform valuable scientific research, whether that be radio science or scientific research on the actual manned missions so that we can push further in the very near future. So to describe a little bit more about space communications, it's easiest to just explain how it works. At its simplest, space communications relies on two things, a transmitter and a receiver. So it's easy to compare this to wireless communications in a home. Each device receives signals from the router, which transmits data from the internet. In space, the same principles apply, only on an enormous scale and at incredible distances. Communicating with spacecraft can be achieved by pointing the antennas directly at the ground station, which consist of antennas that are larger than the size of the football field, or at relay satellites that can then forward data to the ground at these same ground stations. NASA's constellation of tracking and data relay satellites, or TDRS, which I showed an image for that and how it works, are currently operating in geosynchronous orbit and provide global coverage for near space communication. Rather than waiting to pass over a ground station, the TDRS satellites allow for data to be relayed from spacecraft in low Earth orbit constantly. The same concept of constellation-based satellites orbiting other celestial bodies will enable constant communication in deep space and will allow humanity to expand further, and our presence, both manned and robotic, will become permanent. So the complexity of designing communication systems for space rely on many factors, most of which are driven by the scale of the network that they require. While comparing space communications with those on Earth, it's best to consider the distance the data must be transmitted over. In terrestrial communications, cell phones receive wireless data from cell towers that are less than a mile away that are then connected by high-speed optical cables. Space communications must transmit this wireless data over much greater distances without the assistance of the high-speed ground networks. This is why spacecraft communications don't occur instantaneously. The amount of time it takes for a signal to travel to its destination, which is called latency, is the primary factor in the delay of signals. And no matter the method, the time it takes for a signal to travel is currently bound by the speed of light, which in the vacuum of space is approximately 186,000 miles per second. This is why communications with spacecraft in near space is negligible, where transmission delays represent fractions of a second. But when we look at communications for deep space, which is our long-term goal, this delay can represent minutes or even more. While these factors are the most critical to understanding space communications, some additional design considerations that infrastructure developers like us must consider also include system performance, like data rates and sources of interference, the availability of networks to connect to, and the power constraints for a spacecraft that data transmission requires. Details on the design considerations require a much more in-depth conversation. I don't want to put you all to sleep, so we won't go into that today. So we all remember the old Verizon ad. So can you hear me now? Good. But honestly, when I'm looking back at it, I can't remember the last time that I've had to ask that. This shows the progress that we've made on terrestrial networks since the turn of the century. In the same manner, space communications are developing at the same speed. 50 years ago, communications with astronauts in near space were only available around 15% of the time, and that occurred with seconds of delay. Now, communications in this region are available 24/7 in near real time. If we want to push further, we have to develop our deep space communications networks. These communication networks are still in their infancy and will require significant development to reflect the same level of progress. Currently, optical communication technologies are offering the most promising method of improving space communications, where data transmission at the speed of light will improve data rates by 10 to 100 times over what we're capable of today using radio frequency microwave communications. The deep space region will also require humanity to develop a robust network of antennas and relays that can allow for constant communication with Earth-based ground stations while we establish a permanent presence on another celestial body. So we must continue our efforts to develop the next phase of space development, commercializing near space while building the capabilities that enable us to push further. My personal recommendations for humanity as a whole to develop and push further are to research optical communications technologies, which we've been doing for around a decade, but they're not commercially viable, and we need to push that further so that we can enable near real-time or as close to real-time communications with other celestial bodies as possible, rather than dealing with the minutes of delay, so that Earth and wherever we decide to settle can be in communication and safe operations can be achieved without a significant manned presence. We're currently proving autonomous capabilities for early exploration, as well as the commercialization of near space. And doing so in deep space will require additional capabilities and a little bit more confidence in the systems that we have that are currently available today. We also need to look at how we will secure these networks, because that is a major vulnerability for us in terms of expanding further, where signals can currently be hijacked and the reliability of those networks must be ensured, especially if there's going to be large delays, that we can't have real-time monitoring of assets and knowing exactly what they're doing and when they're doing it before it's too late. And further, we need to expand the Earth-based ground network to accommodate the increased bandwidth of a growing space economy. We currently rely on a large network of ground stations, but only 3 are very reliable for deep space communications. This network must expand to allow for the development of additional capabilities and technologies that deep space will require. And we need to be pushing further on developing these stations and making them more affordable and accessible. And there's a great opportunity for emerging nations to have an opportunity to enter the space economy without having to make a significant investment in developing spacecraft, like what the US and other spacefaring nations are doing currently. And finally, the development of dedicated ground stations and relay networks in lunar or Martian orbits will be absolutely necessary for us to have a permanent presence on either of those celestial bodies. If we want to expand further, we have to have permanence in our habitation of a planet, and the only way to do so is to have reliable ground stations and relay networks that allow the astronauts on those bodies to communicate with both Earth as well as the spacecraft that they rely on for any activities in their orbits. So I sped through that a little bit just to try to keep on time, but I wanted to say thank you to Foundation for the Future and for putting this panel together. This was a great opportunity for me to discuss something that's really important to me, and also to motivate others to really look at the scale that the infrastructure development will require. It's not just about the investment in capital, but also the investment in the community and the collaboration between nations, individuals, to develop a robust space economy that will drive humanity further. And excited for this opportunity. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you so much, Trent. That was a great presentation. And yes, if anybody in the Zoom has any questions for Trent, please do drop them in the chat, or you can just turn your video on and ask a question when you're ready. I'll take the first one here while people think about it. Trent, I'm curious what progress that you've seen that you're excited about that we've made towards developing these more robust systems for deep space communication.
Sure. So I think the greatest example in today's development is the network that we created for the Perseverance rover. So the Perseverance rover doesn't communicate directly with Earth from Mars. It actually communicates with a network of orbiting satellites around it. And that's it's a very small scale replica of what will be necessary for us to push further. And that type of testing is exactly what humanity needs to do to push further. And it's been exciting to see how its success and how we can do it on a much larger scale with even greater technologies than when we first started developing that rover.
Yeah, interesting. So when we say we're building a long-term human presence on Mars, we know that our communication with Earth is limited by the speed of light, so there is going to be that latency. What challenges will that present for the technology that we're going to have to be building to sustain that presence?
I think the greatest challenge will be a decision between whether we want to control Mars from Earth or whether we want to have to inhabit Mars so that we can have more robust and detailed exploration activities, because we will have a 10-minute delay even with the speed of light. And that's still very significant when you have high value, high risk operations, and having to over design systems to compensate for that is intensive. The development of habitable ground stations on Mars will be a really exciting opportunity for us to have near real-time communications on a celestial body, but we're at least a decade, if not more, before that's even remotely possible. But it's something that we have to be building towards, and I think we are. So it's exciting to see.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll have one more question here from Peyton Zare. Sorry for my pronunciation if that's wrong, but from a funding perspective, who should be taking the lead on expanding ground-based communications infrastructure? How can the private sector enable this if it requires a significant investment?
So I believe that there is not a commercial application for most of this deep space research and development in the early phases. And having the private sector enable this through their own investment is very high risk, and there's minimal chance of reward in the near term. I personally believe that governments should be taking the first steps in building that initial infrastructure, whether that be the American government, Chinese government, Russian government, or even very small nations that want to have an opportunity to enter the market early, where they can be developing the technologies for ground stations, which have been proven. We have the telescope systems as well as communication systems in allied nations and emerging nations. And both of those have made what really all of our scientific research possible. And in order to expand beyond that, we need to have the support of humanity as a whole. Humanity needs to see that the importance in space travel and becoming a multi-planetary species, and prioritizing their resources so that they have an opportunity to become involved when they weren't able to justify the capital expenditures yet. But I believe that they're starting to, and most nations are looking to be involved in space. So this is a great time to be in it.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with you there. And I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your presentation today. It's been really interesting.
No, thank you for having me, and thank you for the great introduction.
Of course. And with that, I will move on to my next great introduction. I'm excited to have Michael Bloxton on the panel today. So Michael Bloxton, a self-made telecom finance real estate investor, is now the founder and CEO of Nebula Space Enterprise, Inc. He's launched 5 Nebula subsidiaries with a mission to provide humans with access to deep space and infinite resources. Each organization plays a pivotal role in phase 1 of this plan to preserve Earth and its precious resources and propel humanity into a thriving future. A futurist and visionary entrepreneur, Michael Bloxton is the founder, CEO, and chairman of Nebula Space Enterprise, Inc. Using artificial intelligence, machine learning, robotics, sensory, blockchain, and satellite technologies, Nebula will propel humanity into its next phase of evolution via communications, lifestyle, and defense. Michael's focus on communications advancement in space is an extension of 10 years in the cell tower real estate industry, where he cultivated successful plans that returned tangible ROI and made substantial impacts on each client's bottom lines. He then became a commercial real estate entrepreneur, acquiring a diverse portfolio of land, office, industrial, apartment, and retail properties across the US. Sorry, I'm getting a little tongue-tied at the end there, but hi, Michael. Excited to have you on today.
Thanks for having me. I didn't realize my bio was that long. That's cool. Thank you for having me. And I think Trent teed me up perfectly for what we're all talking about here with just comms. And I think that I'm going to take it a slightly different slant. I 100% agree. And I think that last question was even more appropriate. You know, where is the funding coming from? Why do they need to be thinking about this? And I think all of us, Rachel, even you agreed that we would love for everyone to want to be a space explorer. I don't know if we're ever going to get to that unanimous consent, but hopefully some of the data I share now will help tip people that aren't thinking about space the way that they should be. Clearly everyone on this call is, but we'll see. So let me, with that, let me share my screen here. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Sure can. Looks good.
All right. Presenter mode. So again, this is a slightly different slant on why space and why communications? Every once in a while, something revolution comes along that changes the world. And as you mentioned in my bio, we actually have several different companies, 3 very specifically related to communications, compute, blockchain, and cybersecurity. Pretty much if you want to process data in space, you want to be able to trust that data and you want to be able to protect that data. And that's the purpose of those 3 companies. And compute is actually launching compute capability onto the outside of the ISS that is 100 times, and it's a demo, it's 100 times more capable than any other computing known in space today. 1876, Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone, which was revolutionary for how humans communicate. And the telephone has evolved greatly. What we saw in 1983 was internet and cellular communication. So for 100 years, we were literally building 5 million telephone poles to connect the United States alone with telephone. And then in 1983, here comes cellular communications. And as you heard, my background is in cellular. And cellular communications goes on for several decades. And then in 2006 and 2007, we have Steve Jobs with the iPhone, and then AWS is created. And I don't think a lot of people knew that AWS was going to become what it now is, which is the leader of cloud computing. And then that kept going, and we had another revolution here with SpaceX and its reusable rockets, and then specifically Starlink satellites. So if you look at how these things come together as a story, if you go along the bottom there, you can see the development of network data centers and ultimately cloud computing. And I don't know if any one of us actually uses our phone just for a phone. Just to give the example of what it means to have internet, network, cloud computing, et cetera. It's not about the phone. The phone is, even to Trent's point, it's about the communication of data. Sometimes that is a voice set of data, or it's an actual zeros and ones set of data, whether that's pictures or SAR images, et cetera. So if you look along the bottom, the evolution, we built 5 million telephone poles to connect the United States with telephone wire, literally wiring the United States for about 100 years. Then, and that's where my experience comes in, we started building cell phone towers. And we had 500,000 cell phone towers built right now in the United States. So you go an order of magnitude in capability going from telephone wire to cell towers increase, but you decrease the amount of infrastructure required. And then if you go all the way up to Starlink right now, everyone in the space industry is freaking out that we have 50,000, 100,000 cell towers. But again, you're talking about another order of magnitude less infrastructure with an order of magnitude increase in capability once it's all built out. And the unique thing here is we're not talking 5 million for the United States, 500,000 cell towers for the United States. We're talking 50,000 satellites for the entire globe. And there are several companies addressing that underlying base network infrastructure. One other thing that most people don't realize, and again, directly related to my experience, is the ability to route traffic is 100% reliant on computing. So if you think about being able to get connected to someone across the globe, the amount of computing that goes into that, and the amount of computing that goes into pinging your phone 6 times a second to know where you are so that they always know exactly where to route the phone. The data center required literally just to route phone calls and connectivity is immense, let alone actually wanting to do any computation. So the critical, what I think is the weakest link here of again, teeing off of what Trent had gone through with deep space communications, et cetera, the critical link there, the weakest link is computing, because you might be able to have all the connectivity points, but then you won't be able to route it. You're actually seeing that now with some of the companies doing these bigger satellite constellations, including Starlink. The computing issue is just a routing issue. They can't get enough computing just to be able to route the conversations. Now, imagine limitless energy, limitless computing, limitless quantum encrypted communications. Now the combination of those is what will really spur on the next revolution and evolution of humanity. So if we look at how computing is done here, which I'll dive more into in a second, you think about it from a sustainability. And again, I'll give you data in a second. We have the capability, because of space specifically, to connect the entire globe in a sustainable way. So if you think about the entire globe right now, there's 8 billion people on Earth that are connected, not through wireless connectivity. If you again think about the examples I just gave, the amount of wire, and if anyone has seen undersea cables, and this is a big issue with the DoD, is what happens if our undersea cables are cut? How do we connect to all of our partners and our forward operating bases, et cetera? So the opportunity here to build true global connectivity is real because of space. Now, what about secure data transfer? If we move computing into space, we have the ability to move real-time information, highly secured, and this is critical as we're becoming a society that's extremely reliant on digital communications and information. Now, take all these together, energy is already $1 trillion industry, telecom is already $1 trillion industry, and computing is going to be $1 trillion industry in just a few years from now. And then the entire space economy will be, depending on which report you read, $1 trillion by 2030 or 2040. So we're really at a point in society and business, and especially in our capitalist society, of being able to create an opportunity here. And again, going back to the funding, where you can start to see all these dots getting connected. So how will we get there? And how will you find your place in space, which is something Nebula is extremely interested in. This is going to take the village. It's not just an individual or individual company. Well, welcome to Nebula. This is the birthplace of the next evolution. Nebula Compute specifically is bringing cloud computing to space right now. As I mentioned, later this year, we have a demo going on the outside of the ISS that it's 100 times more compute capable than anything else going up in space today. Now, why are we doing this? Why is this so important? Globally, we produce so much energy just in general. And in order to meet the energy demands of humanity, we have to literally produce something like double the amount of all the energy sources we've ever had. And then if you look at just IT and data, we're already using 20% of all of a significant percentage of all of Earth's energy. And then by 2040, it's 20%. That is a very unsustainable path that we're on from an energy perspective and the resources of Earth. So if you think about the limited amount of renewables and non-renewables, the data centers contribute to 0.5% of the total gigatons of emissions. And that was in 2018. It is only growing. Again, we are only seeing a trend to want more data. I'll give you a personal example. I don't know if any of you have taken less photos because the sensor on your phone takes a bigger image size. That's not the case. We take, if anything, we take more photos because now they're beautiful and they're digital, and we don't connect it to needing to take less just because we have the ability to create more. In short, we simply can't meet the energy demand, preserve our air, water, and fuels, and connect the globe by building more terrestrial infrastructure. We can't be building data centers in the middle of the Sahara or digging fiber optic cables all the way across South America and Africa. So Nebula is launching server sets coming. We're actually in design, about to finalize design, should be launching late next year in 2025, going through those sales now. And then we're going to grow into actual data centers in space, a clear path for us. Here's the current state of cloud computing. Now, you heard me talk about energy, which I think a lot of people have been hearing about, but most people don't understand the impacts that data centers have with water. So if you extend Earth's network to space with Nebula server sets, the energy is 100% independent of Earth's using solar and nuclear. So we're not even touching that closed ecosystem of Earth, which is sometimes hard to think about if you do think about the spaceship of Earth as a single unit. We won't need to use that. There's no water required for cooling. There are some data centers that use something seriously ridiculous, like 1 billion gallons of water for cooling. Now they're using less energy, but then they're using 1 billion gallons of potable water, which is absolutely insane. And the heat, the other factor here is heat. Most people don't think of, okay, well, if you had sustainable energy and you had weren't using water, you'd still be putting the heat and converting that energy, however you're using it or getting it, back into heat into the atmosphere. And we're seeing what's happening when you put data centers all the way up in the Arctic And it's basically melting ice. And if you put it into the ocean, you're heating the ocean. And it may seem insignificant, but we're already seeing impacts, real world impacts of how this is not cool. So Nebula is focused on that core part of the infrastructure, not necessarily the communications, but the computing that supports communications and expands the actual network capability. Again, you might be able to relay data, but you'll always be limited by how much data you can relay. And you'll always be limited by what you can do with that data as it's relayed. And that's what Nebula is focused on. So we're already doing this, as you heard. Nebula's core focus here around the computing is ensuring freedom of information, freedom of communication in space. Now, that brings me to the end of it. I tried to run through this. I know everyone's been on here for quite some time. I have been good at getting this around 10 minutes. If you want to find out more in general, we have Nebula in Space Insider, which is a daily newsletter, comes out with all sorts of really cool cutting edge space stuff. Free, you can sign up there, nebulamedia.space/newsletter. NebulaIncorporated.com if you want to learn a little bit more about what phase 1 is all about for Nebula's mission to provide all of humanity access to deep space and infinite resources. We also have a podcast, Your Place in Space. So we just started rolling that out. Very interesting conversations. Tim's actually on one of those that hasn't rolled out yet, but we have him coming up. And then finally, if you want to learn more about me, michaelbloxton.com, MichaelBloxton, michaelbloxton.com if you want to learn more. And that's it. That's the whole spiel.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. I see one already from Adrian. So Michael, how will you cool your satellites? Vacuum is well known as an insulator, same as water, other liquids, superheating and emitting droplets.
That becomes the IP, quite specifically. The radiation is kind of a linear problem if you think about scaling, but thermal is an exponential problem because if you put more things that create heat, you have to get it out. So heat is the way to think about heat in space that's easiest for me, at least, was if you think about it like a liquid, you actually need to move it from the thing that's generating heat and push it out into deep space, because you're absolutely right. I mean, that's why I love this bottle, right? There's no convection through a vacuum. And that is the critical scaling issue that we think we've solved.
Interesting. I've got one while we wait for more people to write in. Michael, I'm curious what changes to the technology infrastructure we already have here on Earth would be needed in order to move this computing power into the space environment?
Nothing. We can leverage everything that we have. Again, the IP that we have is more around the radiation and thermal, but the computing, the idea is that every single year we come up with some generation of computing that's unbelievably better than what we just had a year ago. And if you take just a few years, it's multiple generations and multiple orders of magnitude at times. So the way the space industry works, because they're looking at it from a, hey, I need to be able to protect this and harden this, they typically take the computing today and bring it through this very long process. That's at best, I think it's gotten down to about 2.5 years for the most cutting edge people that don't care about space heritage. For those that care about space heritage, you're taking computing, in the best case scenario is you're taking 6 years before that compute is actually operational. Now, if anyone has a phone that's 6 years old on this call, I would be highly impressed. Unless it's brand new, 6-year-old, like even at that point, I don't think you would use it, because the processing capability for what we've already been able to build with applications is so significantly different that we're not going to be able to keep up with that. So Nebula is taking a very different approach in that we want to be able to take things off the shelf, take servers, take computing that's off the shelf today and get it into space inside 12 months so that we're capable of providing everybody what they really need in terms of accessing the data that we're generating.
I've got a question here from Paul Jurasin, who spoke earlier. So if we have data centers in space, how do we meet the telecommunications speed and capacity needs into the future?
So Trent specifically called out optical communications, and that is extremely early, but not completely nascent. So there's already experiments running on the ISS and down. We're aware of multiple companies that actually have laser comms up. They're not at the scale that we need them to be in terms of gigabits per second bandwidth, But every single company we've talked to and the ones that we're partnered with all have a roadmap by which they can deliver that. So there's no technical issues necessarily with being able to deliver a communications capability. There are a lot of issues and there's a lot of things that we have to overcome, but we're not, I think the point here, when I say technical, we're not violating physics at this point for being able to deliver the capability of laser high-speed bandwidth between even our own satellites. We're not violating physics. It is a tough thing to do, but it is not impossible.
Sure. And Amy here has a question that kind of ties in the two sides of space communications that we've touched on today. Amy's question is, how do you approach comms and messaging to get the space sector involved in these multiple areas of innovation?
So my thing is, space enthusiasts live everywhere, right? All of us are space enthusiasts, and it doesn't matter what our background is. Like, there are space enthusiasts that aren't involved in space whatsoever. So I don't know if getting the space industry on board is what we need to do, or even focused on. It took years. I mean, we've been having this conversation since 2019 with NASA and DoD and DOE about needing to put computing up. And it was originally, hey, that's a great idea. That's novel. That's cool. And then some people were even starkly against putting computing. Why would we ever do that? We have so much capability here on Earth. But it's become highly sensitive topic where everyone now has identified, everyone as in NASA Space Force, DoD, DOE, has already identified within their own realm of whatever it is they're trying to do, a specific use case where computing is holding them back. So we don't even have to talk about why we need to do this from people that are already actively in space. They've already identified use cases where this is an issue and we need to solve it, or else we won't be able to do X, Y, and Z. So my thinking is, and that's a very small percentage. If you think about the space community that we have, it's a very tight-knit group. You go to these events and you see a lot of the same people all the time. My goal is to get the people that aren't aware of these benefits to space, which is why I kind of took the slant of sustainability around energy and water and data centers, and then connecting the other 4 billion people on the planet. Right now, it's roughly half the people are connected to the internet, high-speed internet. Half the people aren't. So how many people can contribute to society as a whole once you actually get them connected to the internet and connected to the rest of society? So taking that tack from Nebula's perspective is more important because it's easier to, oh man, someone's going to quote me on this, but I'm going to quote somebody else and I forget who gave it to me. It's easier to give birth than to raise the dead. So if you think about, it's easier for us to create a new space enthusiast than it is to take someone who staunchly believes in whatever space perspective they have and then have them change that perspective. Hope that answered the question.
Yeah, sure. I think that's an interesting perspective. Adrian has another follow-up question to his earlier one about cooling these satellites. He asks if you're favoring smaller satellites for cooling and how that balances against the idea that there's better efficiency of comms computing and hardware, et cetera, from larger satellites.
Adrian, we should connect on LinkedIn, by the way. And then obviously I gave you a bunch of different things. So unfortunately, we don't have a choice. If you think about the problem we're trying to address, which is computing, you need more. Flat out, you need more. And if you look at the single greatest, I'll give you an example. If you own a data center here and you're talking to somebody else that owns a data center, the way you talk about the data center is literally in megawatts. I have a 10 megawatt data center. I have a 2 megawatt data center. It's not about the compute capability. It's literally about the energy they use. And if you think about even going back to the example of telecom, they're now looking at, well, I have this much compute capability based on the amount of kilowatts and megawatts that it uses, even in telecom. So the conversation shifts directly to the amount of energy. Adrian, so to your point, you need size because you need to generate a significant amount of energy, but you also need to be able to dissipate that heat. And again, that's the problem that Nebula is corely focused on, is this thermal issue, but we need size. So we're not going to go CubeSat. And quite frankly, if you think about data centers here on Earth, like you could have a server rack in your office, but you're not going to have a data center in your office. If you have a data center in your office, it's going to be an oven. And it's always made sense for all these companies, every company in the world, to go bigger and better. So I think that same terrestrial model is going to play out in space.
Thank you, Michael. I have one more question that I'm interested in. I'm curious to know how large this network would have to be in space in order to offload the sustainability pressures that data sensors are creating on Earth right now.
Good question. So that's why it's a long-term goal. We have so much infrastructure, right? I mean, we're serving 4 billion people. So the amount of infrastructure and the amount of energy, we need to get to the point where, and I don't think we'll ever get to the point where we're not using Earth, right? Earth has its base infrastructure. I mean, it's crazy, but I'm sure some of us still know people that have a wired phone. I mean, I have a couple buildings that I own where I am forced to have a wired phone for the elevator, which is kind of ridiculous. Can't have wireless in that particular instance for safety. So there is still a need. There's always going to be a need for infrastructure. We need to get to the point where we're offloading, we're extending Earth's network, which is really kind of the first phase of supporting sustainability. Next is then being able to use the growth. The other 4 billion people shouldn't ever be using necessarily Earth systems. They should be using space systems. And then you can get to the point after that, which I think is, you're probably looking at like 2 decades before you actually have a measurable impact against anything that Earth is creating.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for hopping on today, Michael. I think that is it for the questions in the chat. I'm just going to check that I'm not missing anything. But I appreciate you hopping on and showing this presentation today. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, no worries. I'm glad I could keep it short and sweet, keep us on time.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have any contact information you want to share in the chat, now is a great time to do that. But for the rest of us, thank you all for joining today. It's been a great conversation. I hope you all enjoy the presentations from our panelists today. That is a wrap for January. We will see you again February 14th and 21st with more. The registration pages for those dates will be up soon, and the topic will be national security space. So thank you all so much for joining. It's been great, and we will see you next time.